Hey, before we start, a trigger warning. This episode discusses sexual trauma, addiction, media influence, and emotional disconnection. If you need space, take it. But if you're ready to talk about what nobody wants to say out loud, welcome. I'm Alexandra, and this is Cluster Fudge. Today's episode, Sex-Obsessed World. Let's get into it. Sex is everywhere. All right, let's get right into it. Sex, it's everywhere. Like literally everywhere you look, hear, or scroll. And I'm not just talking about the obvious stuff, TV shows, movies, magazines, and those wild billboards you can't seem to avoid on your way to work. No, it goes way beyond that. Think about social media, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, platforms where millions of people post photos, videos, and memes every day, often dripping with sexual energy. From influencer culture to the viral dances and challenges, sex sells, sex entertains, and sex engages.
Alexandra.
Ever noticed how your feed suddenly gets flooded with ads for lingerie, dating apps, or even those little products that nobody really talks about out loud? Yeah, that's not a coincidence. The pervasiveness of sexual content. Sexual content isn't confined to the adult section anymore. It's integrated into pop culture, marketing, music, even children's cartoons in subtle ways. Advertisers use sex appeal as a shortcut to grab attention and sell everything from soda to sneakers. Remember those perfume commercials with mysterious, steamy vibes? Or pop songs with lyrics that leave very little to the imagination? Sex is a tool, a weapon, and sometimes a game, all wrapped into one. Why is sex so ubiquitous? But why is sex everywhere? What makes it so effective? Biologically, humans are wired to respond to sexual stimuli. Sex is linked to reproduction, that's survival 101. But it's also deeply tied to pleasure, identity, and social connection. Sex triggers strong emotions, grabs attention, and can create powerful psychological responses, which marketers and media producers have learned to exploit. There's also a cultural obsession at play. Sex sells because it's taboo, exciting, and emotional. People are naturally drawn to it because it taps into fundamental human desires. Love, acceptance, intimacy, and yes, sometimes just pure physical pleasure. The double-edged sword. But here's the catch. While sex being everywhere might seem harmless or even empowering, it has a darker side too. It can create unrealistic expectations about sex and relationships. It can objectify bodies and reduce people to just sexual objects. It can pressure individuals to conform to narrow definitions of attractiveness or sexual behavior. What this means for us. Today, we're going to explore how this sex-obsessed world affects our personal lives, our relationships, and even our sense of self. How does constant exposure to sexualized end messages shape our desires, our insecurities, and the way we connect with others? Spoiler alert, it's complicated. But by the end of this episode, I hope we'll have a clearer picture of what it means to live in a world where sex is everywhere and how we can navigate it on our own terms. So buckle up. Let's dive deep into this sex-obsessed world and unpack what's really going on beneath the surface. A brief history of sexual control. So, now that we've established that sex is everywhere, let's rewind the tape a bit and look at something that might seem surprising. Despite society's obsession with sex, it has also been controlled, restricted, and policed throughout history. The paradox of sex and control. Sex is a paradox. On one hand, it's openly displayed and used to sell products, grab attention, and entertain. On the other, it's often shrouded in shame, silence, and strict rules, especially for certain groups of people. Why? Because sex has always been tied to power. Controlling sex means controlling bodies, identities, and even entire communities. Ancient and religious roots of sexual control. If we look back, many early civilizations placed strict regulations on sexual behavior, often through religion. In ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, sexual conduct was linked to religious rituals but also governed by strict societal rules about who could have sex, when, and with whom. In the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, sex was framed primarily as something for procreation within marriage. Sex outside those bounds was often considered sinful or taboo. These religious frameworks shaped Western society for centuries, setting up binaries: good sex versus bad sex, pure versus impure, chaste versus sinful. And these binaries weren't just about morality, they were tools to control women's bodies, restrict their autonomy, and enforce gender roles. The role of patriarchy. Patriarchy, the system where men hold primary power, heavily influenced sexual control. Women's sexuality was policed to ensure purity and property rights. Female virginity before marriage was prized as a symbol of family honor. Meanwhile, men's sexual freedom was often unchecked or even encouraged. Sexual control and race. Sexual control wasn't just about gender, also intersected deeply with race. Enslaved black women in the Americas, for example, were denied any control over their own bodies, subjected to sexual violence by enslavers. At the same time, myths about black women's hypersexuality were weaponized to justify this abuse, while also stigmatizing black bodies. Fast forward to the Victorian era, a time often remembered for its prudishness. Publicly, sex was silenced, considered scandalous to even mention. Yet behind closed doors, the era spawned a booming underground industry: erotic literature, art, and prostitution. This duality, repression in public, obsession in private, is something we still see today. The 1960s and 70s ushered in the sexual revolution, a time of breaking taboos, fighting for sexual freedom, and challenging norms. Contraception became widely available. Feminists and activists pushed for sexual rights, LGBTQ+ visibility, and bodily autonomy. But with progress came backlash from conservative movements, religious groups, and governments aiming to reassert control. Today, sexual control looks different but is very much alive. Laws regulate what kind of sex education is allowed in schools. Social media platforms censor sexual content unevenly, often policing marginalized bodies more harshly. The Me Too movement revealed how power dynamics can abuse sexuality, yet also sparked important conversations about consent. Understanding this history matters because it shows us that sex isn't just a personal act, it's political. Our ideas about what is acceptable or normal come from centuries of control, shaped by religion, patriarchy, race, and culture. Next, we'll explore how this history shapes the sex-obsessed world we live in today and what it means for our freedom, pleasure, and identity. The porn generation. So we've talked about how sex is everywhere and the history of sexual control, but now let's zoom in on one of the biggest forces shaping our modern relationship with sex: pornography. Porn as a cultural phenomenon. Porn isn't new. It's existed in various forms for thousands of years, from ancient erotic art to underground magazines. But the internet completely exploded the way porn is created, distributed, and consumed. Now it's more accessible than ever before. Just a few clicks and you're in a vast ocean of sexual content, from softcore to hardcore, mainstream to niche, amateur to professional. Today's generation, especially young people, are often called the porn generation because many have their first exposure to sex through porn, sometimes even before any formal sex education. That can create a confusing, often distorted picture of what sex is and should be. Porn often portrays exaggerated, unrealistic scenarios where pleasure is performative, bodies are flawless, and consent or communication is barely there. The impact on expectations and relationships. This can have a major impact on sexual expectations and relationships. Many people compare themselves or their partners to what they see on screen, which can lead to insecurity or dissatisfaction. Porn rarely shows real intimacy, vulnerability, or emotional connection, which are essential parts of healthy sex. It can also normalize aggressive or one-sided sexual behavior. the debate harmful or helpful? Porn is complicated. It's not all bad. Some porn is ethical, consensual, and diverse, and can even be a positive outlet for exploring sexuality. But the mainstream porn industry is often criticized for exploitation, unrealistic standards, and reinforcing harmful stereotypes about gender, race, and sexual roles. There's also growing research about how excessive or compulsive porn use might affect brain chemistry, relationships, and mental health. One big reason porn has such power is the lack of comprehensive sex education. Without accurate, healthy information about bodies, pleasure, and consent, many turn to porn as their teacher. That leaves a lot of room for misinformation and confusion. Porn and consent culture. The rise of movements like Me Too has sparked important conversations about consent, yet porn rarely reflects these realities. It's crucial to separate fantasy from reality and learn to communicate openly about boundaries and desires. Otherwise, the porn generation risks adopting unhealthy ideas about what sex should look like. Moving forward. The good news? There's a growing wave of sex educators, activists, and creators producing ethical porn, focused on real pleasure, diversity, and respect. Platforms like Erica Lust and others are leading the charge for better representation and consent on screen. Plus, sex-positive education is becoming more accessible, teaching people to navigate their desires and relationships with knowledge and care. Coming up next, we'll explore how social media feeds into this sex-obsessed culture and what it means for identity, pressure, and connection. Social media, the sexual marketplace. All right, so we've talked about porn's massive influence on how sex is perceived, but now let's talk about another huge player, social media. If porn is the giant underground river shaping our ideas about sex, social media is like a sprawling city built up of it, visible, constant, and unavoidable. The sexual marketplace, what is it? You might have heard the term sexual marketplace. It's the idea that dating, attraction, and even sexuality have become something to be marketed, priced, and consumed. And social media is the ultimate marketplace. On apps like Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and even dating apps like Tinder or Bumble, people showcase their bodies, personalities, and lifestyles as if they're products. Likes, follows, comments all act as currency. It's not just about connection anymore. It's about visibility, validation, and performance. Social media encourages carefully curated identities. People present the best version of themselves, often hypersexualized or idealized. Filters, lighting, and editing tools help craft a look that's deemed attractive. People often emphasize physical appearance, sexual availability, or flirtatiousness as a way to gain attention. This creates what some call sexual capital, basically how desirable someone is perceived to be, which can influence social status. The pressure to perform. This environment creates intense pressure to perform sexually, even outside of dating apps. Influencers and creators might feel they have to post sexy or provocative content to maintain relevance and followers. Younger users often internalize these messages, feeling like their worth depends on how they look or how much attention they get. This can be exhausting and damaging to self-esteem. Sexualization of everyday life. Social media blurs the line between public and private and between genuine expression and performance. Everyday moments get sexualized or framed as flirtatious or seductive, even when that might not be the intent. This sexualization seeps into all parts of life, shaping how we interact, how we dress, and even how we speak. The double-edged sword of connection. Of course, social media isn't all bad when it comes to sexuality. It offers spaces for sexual education, community building, and expression, especially for marginalized groups who've historically been excluded from mainstream narratives. Platforms have allowed queer, disabled, and body-positive communities to celebrate their identities and challenge traditional beauty standards. The dark side, harassment and sober shaming. But social media can also be a breeding ground for harassment, body shaming, and what's now called sober shaming. People who choose to abstain from sex, dating, or even alcohol can be mocked or ostracized online. Women and LGBTQ+ folks often face disproportionate sexual harassment or unwanted advances. The pressure to conform to sexual norms on social media can feel oppressive. Navigating the sexual marketplace mindfully. So, how do we survive and thrive in this sexual marketplace? Be mindful about how social media affects your self-esteem and desires. Remember that what you see is curated, not the full picture. Set boundaries. Know when to step back or mute content that harms your mental health. Use social media intentionally. Follow creators and communities that uplift and educate rather than pressure or shame.
Coming up.
We'll explore how all these pressures around sex and identity can impact mental health and what we can do to reclaim our sense of self. Neuroscience of obsession. Let's get into the science, because obsession isn't just a cultural or emotional experience, it's biochemical. There's actually a neurological basis for why our world feels so sex-obsessed and why some of us may feel overwhelmed, overstimulated, or even addicted to sexual imagery, attention, or content. The brain on sex. When we engage with sexual content, whether it's watching porn, sexting, scrolling through suggestive images, or even fantasizing, our brain releases a cocktail of chemicals. The main players? Dopamine, the reward chemical responsible for pleasure, motivation, and reinforcing behaviors. Oxytocin, the bonding hormone, especially active after orgasm or emotional intimacy. Endorphins, natural painkillers that promote euphoria. Serotonin regulates mood and often dips during intense obsession or withdrawal. All of these chemicals create a kind of neurochemical high. It feels good, really good, which is why our brains want more. The dopamine feedback loop. Here's where it gets tricky. Our brains are wired to repeat pleasurable experiences. This is how habits and addictions form. Every time you get a sexy text, swipe on a dating app, or view explicit content, your brain releases dopamine. But over time, you need more stimulation to get the same high. This leads to desensitization. You may need more extreme content, more novelty, or more validation just to feel the same level of excitement. This dopamine feedback loop is part of what fuels sexual obsession in the digital age. It's not just about desire, it's about a brain trained to chase reward over and over. Comparison to addiction. Now, let's be clear. Not all sexual engagement is addiction, but neuroscience shows that compulsive sexual behavior can activate the brain in similar ways to drugs like cocaine or nicotine. This can interfere with focus, sleep, relationships, and even mental health. People may feel guilt, shame, or distress, especially when their behavior doesn't match their values. This is becoming more common with constant access to sexual stimuli online. Obsession isn't always sexual. And it's not always about sex itself. It can be about attention, validation, or power. Posting a sexy selfie and watching likes roll in, dopamine hit. Getting flirted with in the DMs, another reward loop. For many, the obsession is less about physical pleasure and more about emotional regulation, using sexual attention to soothe loneliness, stress, or boredom. Here's the good news. Your brain can rewire itself. That's the power of neuroplasticity. If you recognize that you're caught in an unhealthy loop, whether that's porn, constant sexting, or endless swiping, you can change. It takes time and intention. Things like mindfulness, therapy, journaling, and even reducing screen time can help. You're not broken. Your brain has just learned a pattern, and patterns can be unlearned. So, when we talk about a sex-obsessed world, we're not just talking about what's around us, but what's happening inside of us too. Next, let's get into how all of this obsession, the social pressure, the stimulation, the comparison, is impacting our mental health and sense of self. The emotional toll. Okay, Let's slow things down. We've talked about how sex saturates our screens, our brains, our dating lives, even our sense of self-worth. But now it's time to talk about something that often goes unspoken in all this, the emotional toll. Because behind the dopamine hits and the thirst traps and anxiety, insecurity, and a deep aching loneliness. Burnout from constant performance. One of the biggest emotional consequences of living in a sex-obsessed world is the pressure to constantly perform. Whether it's your appearance, your sexual prowess, or even your desirability, there's this unspoken rule that you have to always be on. And it's exhausting. Women are expected to be sexually empowered, but not too much. Men are expected to be confident and dominant, but never vulnerable. Queer folks are often hypersexualized or erased altogether. This performative pressure can lead to burnout, and over time people may feel disconnected from their own desires. Like you're playing a role in someone else's movie, not your own life. Anxiety and shame. Let's talk about anxiety, because it's real. Anxiety around how you look, how you perform, if you're enough. The fear of rejection. The fear of being too much or not enough. The shame that creeps in after sex, or after watching porn, or after comparing yourself to someone with a perfect body online. Many people, especially younger generations, report feeling numb or disassociated from sex altogether. Because when you're constantly exposed to extreme versions of sexuality, your own experiences can feel small or broken. The loneliness paradox. Here's the paradox. We live in a world that's hyper-connected. Sexts, snaps, matches, DMs, but we're lonelier than ever. Digital intimacy isn't the same as emotional intimacy. You can have dozens of people watching your story or swiping on your face and still feel completely alone. You might be desired but not seen, touched but not held, talked to but not heard. And that kind of loneliness, it cuts deep. It makes people question their worth, their identity, their ability to love or be loved. The impact on self-esteem and identity. When your value is constantly tied to sex or beauty, your sense of self becomes fragile. For many women and femmes, aging becomes a source of dread because desirability is treated like a deadline. For men, lack of sexual conquest can feel like failure. For queer and trans folks, not fitting into rigid sexual or aesthetic molds can lead to exclusion, even from within their own communities. It becomes easy to internalize this idea that your worth is your body, your sex appeal, or your ability to keep someone's attention. But that's a lie. That's the illusion this culture sells. Emotional detachment and disconnection. Alexandra. Eventually, some people check out emotionally. Sex becomes mechanical. Dating becomes a numbers game. Intimacy becomes a transaction. Vulnerability becomes too dangerous. This is where you start to see patterns of emotional detachment, the inability to connect deeply because people are scared to feel, scared to be rejected, scared to be seen. A cultural wake-up call. Alex, hopeful but honest, we're overdue for a wake-up call. We need to start having honest conversations about the cost of this obsession, not just on our bodies or our morals, but on our hearts. We are more than our sex lives. We are more than our photos, our flings, our performance. And healing begins when we start separating our worth from how sexually valuable society tells us we are. Coming up, we'll explore how people are breaking free from these cultural chains. We'll look at the rise of sexual boundaries, celibacy, intentional dating, and reclaiming your body and mind in the next segment, Reclaiming Desire, Moving Toward Healing. Reclaiming sexuality. So we've taken a long look at the sexual chaos around us, the noise, the pressure, the noise, the pressure, the obsession. But now let's have something revolutionary. Reclaiming your sexuality. Not the version you were taught by the media. Not the version that gets you the most likes. Not the version shaped by shame, trauma, or expectation. I'm talking about your sexuality. On your terms. What does reclaiming mean? Reclaiming your sexuality means stepping out of the performance and stepping into truth. It's about slowing down enough to ask, what do I actually want? Not what I think I'm supposed to want, not what I've been conditioned to crave, not what gets attention, praise, or validation. It's about reconnecting with your body, not as a product to be consumed, but as something sacred, feeling, and wise.
The power of saying no.
One of the most radical things you can do in a sex-obsessed world: say no. No to hookups that leave you empty. No to scrolling past content that triggers insecurity. No to dating games that exhaust your soul. No to sex when you really need connection. Your boundaries are powerful. They're not about withholding. They're about protecting your energy, your heart, and your peace. Embracing slow intimacy. What happens when we slow down? We rediscover the tenderness in touch. We find intimacy in conversation, in eye contact, in shared silence. We build trust before bodies. We allow desire to bloom instead of forcing it to explode. Slowing down doesn't mean giving up on sexuality. It means making it deeper, richer, more human. Consent as liberation. Let's not forget, consent isn't just about safety, it's about liberation. It's saying, I have the right to choose my pleasure, to change my mind, to communicate my needs, to ask for slowness, gentleness, roughness, stillness, whatever is real for me. Reclaiming sexuality also means reclaiming your voice, because silence isn't sexy, honesty is. Redefining sexy. What if we redefined sexy, not as how naked you are, or how hard you pose, or how much you're desired by others, but how much you desire your own life? Sexy can be feeling safe in your body, laughing with someone who sees you, reading in bed with no one watching, saying no thank you without apology, having sex because you want to, not because you feel like you should. That's the new sexy. That's the new standard. Practices for healing and reclamation. If you're on this journey, here are a few powerful ways to start reclaiming your sexuality. 1. Therapy, especially sex-positive, trauma-informed therapy. 2. Mindful touch practices, like sensual movement, self-massage, or breath work. 3. Journaling. Ask yourself, what turns me on emotionally, spiritually, mentally? 4. Celibacy or intentional abstinence, not as punishment, but as a reset. 5. Community. Finding people who support your truth, not just your image. Healing doesn't have to look like total abstinence, and it doesn't have to mean constant activity either. It's a spectrum. You get to define it. Closing thoughts. We are living in a sex-obsessed world, but we don't have to be owned by it. We can rewrite the story. We can build lives that are sensual, safe, sacred, and so much more than performative. You are more than your image. You are more than your appeal. You are not here to be consumed. You are here to be whole. This is just the beginning. If today's conversation stirred something in you, confusion, questions, hope, good. That means you're awake. That means something inside you wants more. This is just the beginning. Thanks for listening to Cluster Fudge. I'm Alexandra, and I'll see you in the next episode. Until then, be kind to yourself, be honest, and never forget, your body, your boundaries, your soul, they're yours to reclaim.